Hello and welcome to TelecomTV. We're in Dusseldorf in Germany at the SDN OpenFlow World Congress 2014. I'm Martin Warwick and I'm talking with Carl Whale, Director of Product Marketing at Radisys. Carl, good to see you again. We met under rather more noisy circumstances back in Barcelona. Best part of getting off for a year ago, 9 months ago now.
Yep.
Good to see you again. We're here at the what is very much an NFV focused event, standards based event. A lot of talk about open source and open systems. We'll come to that in a moment. You've launched a new product here at the show. Tell us what that is first, and we'll talk about how that fits into specific parts of NFV.
Yeah. Yes, in September we launched our T100 platform. That is particularly focusing on things like the data plane challenges for NFV, or at least trying to address those. So it's particularly about adding more intelligence into the load balancing and the traffic distribution part of the platform. So it's a COTS platform. And it's really trying to address some of the scalability issues we see around orchestration and service chaining as well.
And what are those problems? I believe, if you're upscaling, it has an immediate effect on orchestration, doesn't it?
Well, one of the challenges with data plane is we're dealing with many millions of sessions. If you consider, a typical central office and how many subscribers and how many sessions you have on each individual cell phone, for instance, you're talking about tens of millions, maybe even scaling up into hundreds of millions of flows you need to track. Now, OpenFlow is a relatively inefficient protocol from that point of view, in terms of new flow comes in, has to go to the controller, up into orchestration, what do I do with this, send it back down. When you're dealing with terabits or hundreds of gigabits of traffic and, as I say, 10, 50 million subscribers, it won't keep up with it.
Right.
You need some level of automation on flow assignments, so you need to be able to assign the rules, load balance, do your traffic distribution, and then give orchestration the opportunity to move those if it wants. But you need to do it more autonomously in that first load balancing decision. Otherwise, you'll start to limit yourselves to 10, 20, 30,000 updates per second, rather than the sort of multiple millions of updates per second that you actually need.
Okay. NFV for fixed line is one thing. NFV as applied to mobile is another. What are the major differences, Carl?
The number of subscribers and the throughput. So today, typically the actual data rates on mobile are lower than obviously in fixed line.
Sure.
But the number of subscribers are much higher, the number of sessions you need to track are much higher, you're doing many more things in parallel. And again, that comes back to this idea of, how do I track this many flows? How am I able to deal with new flows coming in at such a very high rate? And that's particularly prevalent on things like the GI LAN, where you have all these multiple services that you need to track.
Indeed. What about service chaining? How does that work?
Well, that's a big topic here.
It sure is.
Absolutely.
Well, they seem to be focused. I mean, there's a lot of talk about it, but there obviously seem to be some challenges there. What are they?
Yeah, so, the principle of service chaining is actually removing redundancy of functions. So today, each of these are effectively deployed as a serial fashion. So your parental control, your DPI box, your policy box, your content delivery. And each of those have overhead functions around load balancing. And the idea of this is that if you have that centrally controlled, you can then steer traffic depending on where it needs to go, which depends on what service it is. And so the whole concept of service chaining needs more intelligence in the load balancing decisions. You need to be aware of the flows, you need to be aware of the applications. And so what you find today is, if you go with a COTS platform, if you go with a sort of simple white box switch based on just standard commercial silicon, you can't actually do service chaining with that unless you put something more intelligent in the front of it as a dedicated load balancer. Now, within the mobile networks, we're still dealing with a very highly distributed architecture. This is not one big data center, it's highly distributed. And so you don't want to have to put one of these load balancers in everywhere, and you don't want to have to be sending traffic back and forth between different sites. So our view is, for certain sites with certain levels of scalability, why not put that intelligence and that intelligent switching in the same COTS device that you have? Then you have this COTS virtualized platform with that intelligent load balancing and traffic steering. Once you do that, it becomes much more easy, much more simple to actually do service chaining within that environment.
Thank you. One of the another big emphasis here is on openness. Open standards. We've talked about OpenFlow. How important is openness as far as you are concerned?
Oh, absolutely. It's fundamental to it. And so you have some of the, obviously you have OpenStack as part of orchestration, you have OpenFlow. There are also alternatives to OpenFlow out there that we're also working with around things like forces. So again, it's going to come down to operators and what they want to use within their network. And so openness is very key. Obviously, there's many different distributions out there. But it's also that, you know, again, if you listen at the conference, there's still a lot of questions around orchestration. That wants to be openness, OpenFlow. But there's actually some disagreement that I'm sensing between what is the orchestrator. Is the orchestrator one big overseeing entity, or actually is the orchestration layer, is the orchestration element going to be layered for each of the different functions? And that will be an interesting one, because it then is no longer an all-seeing, overarching controller, and the actual authoritative part of it needs to be somewhere else. So that was an interesting development.
Is there a consensus about that?
I haven't seen it yet. I've actually seen two opinions from different operators, from different network operators, who think it should be layered, and yet when I listen to the equipment manufacturers and some of the providers of orchestration, they're saying it should be centralized in one big entity.
Now, why would that be?
I think they need to work it out.
Why would that be?
I think as the operators are going through their proof of concepts, as they're going through, they're identifying concerns in scalability. And that's one of the concerns we have in terms of scalability, is if I have one box that's handling, you know, 0.5 terabit of traffic and 200 million subscribers, and everything that box does has to go up to orchestration, and there's many of these boxes in the network, how does that scale? And what happens if that fails at the orchestration layer in terms of HA? So I think there's still a lot of questions around those aspects, and that's what these conferences help to discuss the topics, and then also of course, hopefully come up with solutions in time.
The last question to you, which is about SDN rather than NFV. The attraction, the utility of NFV is very evident, certainly as far as service providers in fixed line area is concerned, and also in mobile. SDN less so. The focus over the past months has been very much more on NFV than on SDN, but suddenly particularly the tier 1 operators are talking about the importance of SDN alongside NFV. What's the basis of the sort of the talk there?
Yeah, well, I think from an NFV point of view, you know, we have a lot of the tools that have come across from data centers. We have the hypervisor and everything else. We can actually build those proof of concepts, and a lot of the tools are there. And once you've got that virtualized, it seems now that SDN follows NFV rather than the other way around. I think when we were at Barcelona, we were saying SDN comes first, NFV builds on top of that. What I'm hearing this week is it's the other way around. And I've just heard that from EE, for instance, in their last discussion, where they said SDN is a way of enabling them to reconfigure networks more quickly.
Indeed.
Avoid the truck roll.
Indeed.
And also, most of the problems that network operators seem to have with outages and things like that is human error driven. And if you can automate this, and SDN brings this level of automation, you can hopefully reduce those sort of outages. So it does seem to have spun around the other way, but it's still there, it's still coming, it's still a requirement.
It's interesting how it's changed in a mere, 9-10 months?
Exactly, yes.
I remember us talking about it before, and the emphasis being very, very much on SDN.
Yeah.
And then suddenly NFV seems to have taken over everywhere.
Yeah, but I think that's been driven by the momentum we have from Etsy in terms of POCs. It's all been around NFV, how do I virtualize it, how do I control it? Yeah. That emphasis has now moved towards orchestration as well, and how do I control this from the orchestration layers, but then also how do I make my networks more reconfigurable, and I think the SDN is trailing that, and I think that's just because the amount of momentum and market pressure to get the NFV portion moving forward. I don't think we've solved everything yet, but get it moving forward, and obviously, you know, there's been great progress in the last year, and then once we move that forward, then SDN is part of it. So from Radisys' point of view, we're actively working on SDN as much, if not more, than on NFV, but that mainly comes from our data plane heritage, I think.
Of course. Well, all being well, we'll both be in Barcelona in a few months' time, and we'll see whether the pendulum's swinging back the other way, won't we?
Absolutely.
Until then, Carl Whale, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.